Okay, our next question is about shallow depth of field. It says, this means setting your aperture to f2.8 to 3.5. So it creates a look where your subject is tack sharp and the background falls beautifully out of focus. This draws more attention to your subject.
Yep, pretty self-explanatory there. That's typically why you end up paying the big bucks for the what we call fast lenses, and they create a shallower depth of field. And the reason being is because the opening, referred to as the aperture, is larger, so it lets more light in. And typically, when you have a camera that has a large opening like that, which is an f2.8 or a lower number than that, and the apertures can kind of throw people off a lot because the lower the number, the larger the aperture. Photographers are notorious for having several different words or terminologies for the same thing. So a lot of the times we will talk about shooting with a fast lens. And what we mean by that is typically a fast lens is something that has an aperture of 2.8 or lower. And now with the new mirrorless cameras, I know for a fact that Nikon increased the size of their lens mount. I don't know if Canon and Sony did. Well, I think Sony's kind of had the same, if I'm not mistaken. But for the longest time with the old DSLRs, the fastest lens that Nikon could make was a 1.4. And it was due to the physical limitations of the actual lens mount. And so now Nikon has several f1.2 aperture lenses, and they even have an f.95. It's called the knocked lens. And when I talked to the folks at Nikon at imaging this year, I specifically asked them, I was like, what's the point with the knock? Because from my perspective, I felt like Nikon just made it because they could. And come to find out, that's exactly what it was. It's a 58 millimeter f0.95 knocked. It's a manual focus only lens, and it's a trophy piece, really is what it is. It's an $8,000 overpriced, over-engineered, but man, is it beautiful. I think where it has its best use case is in video. So with the 58 millimeter focal length and that 0.95, you get a razor thin depth of field. And when you're using it for video, a lot of the times you're putting it on a rig where you can control focus either with a focus pull machine, or if I was to put it on my Ronin, I could set up the Raven Eye and their electronic focus, and I can actually turn a manual focus lens into an autofocus lens. But that's a topic for another conversation. That's why a fast lens is important, if not vital, for portraiture photography, which is what we're mainly talking about in these series here. It's all based on the magazine that we've got here. Yet having that shallow depth of field is super important to be able to separate your subject from your background. And one of the biggest things that novice photographers do that is kind of counterintuitive to this is they find an interesting background and they put their subject right on top of it, like a brick wall.
It creates a lot of clutter.
Right. So if you're shooting with shallow depth of field in mind, and you want that brick wall, you don't shoot single point perspective where you're perpendicular to the wall. You shoot with a vanishing point perspective where the wall trails off in the background. That way you can throw
standing more at an angle.
Yeah, you stand at an angle so you could throw that background out of focus, but you still have the effect of the brick wall. That's one thing to really keep in mind. If you're going for that shallow depth of field look, you want to put some distance between your subject and the background. And that distance is going to depend on the focal length of your lens. If you have a wider field of view, right, where you're on like a 24 millimeter or a 35 millimeter or something like that, you need them to be further away from their background to create that separation. Whereas if you were shooting with 70 millimeters, 105, 135, 200, they can be a little bit closer because as your focal length increases, the depth of field decreases.
So let's say instead of a brick wall, you have a mural that they're standing in front of. And so you want that to be in focus. Would you still shoot from an angle, or what would you personally, how would you shoot something like that?
Right. So for those, it's a portrait where your elements of your your scene are part of that portrait, are an important part of the portrait. And when that is considered, it really is going to depend on the creator
Yeah.
as to how they want to portray that image.
As far as like the angle of attack, so to speak.
Right. As far as the angle and as far as the depth of field issue. If you had a mural or something, let's say I wanted to take, it's an environmental portrait. That's what it's called. An
Okay.
environmental portrait.
Okay.
So if I wanted to take a picture of, let's say there's a mural.
Yeah.
And I'm taking a picture of the person who painted the mural.
So, okay. So they're standing with the, yep.
So they're standing with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that instance, I would want that mural to be just as tack sharp as my subject.
Absolutely.
Right. So I would set a higher aperture number, F9, F11, F13, F16, whatever the case may be there. Right. Whereas if I was doing an environmental portrait for a football player or a soccer player, it's not so important that the field and everything itself be tack sharp, but to be understandable to the end viewer
like
that they are on a football field or on a soccer field, right? So there's a different approach to it depending on the end result that you're looking
on
for.
how much of a blur basically that you want in the background. So
correct.
To speak.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, I love it. Thank you.